Blended Podcasts. Brought to you by Blended Audio.
ArtPod is a South African-focused visual arts podcast hosted by Claude Chandler. Join me weekly every Saturday as I'm joined by a new guest who occupies a position within the visual arts community, ranging from fine arts, tattooing, framing, and logistics. Welcome to episode 13 of Pod Art. I'm joined today by Swain Hoogervorst. I think I said it wrong again, right?
It's a work in progress. I'm still working on it. It's 31 years. It's pronounced Hoogervorst.
Hoogervorst. It just slips my mind every time. Anyways, we first were introduced to each other when I applied for studio space at Eastside. And upon doing so, the bit of research I did on you, what came up was your swimming pool series that you did at the AVA show. And then I guess a number of other works dealing with, I guess, your swimming pool series came up. And then kind of seeing how you navigated into more of, I would say, abstract botanicals in a way, and your partnership with Everard Reed. And within doing the research, just the way you navigated everything, I had this idea of a UCT Michaelis student. You know, you do the AVA show and then you end up in Everard Reed. I'm like, it's the perfect story of the CapeTown artist. But upon doing so, or upon researching before this interview, I see you actually went to Vega. Can you just tell me about that and how through Vega, like, fine art came about?
I mean, I've been doing art probably from most of my life, since I was probably about 7 years old, but it was never something that was, I guess, a conscious pursuit in terms of an aim of, okay, I'm gonna grow up and being an artist. It was just something I've always done and that I've need to have done. And I, you know, when I finished high school, I thought about studying art, and in all honesty, I didn't think it was necessary. In hindsight, maybe I can understand they could have, you know, I don't know, like from a networking point of view, and I could see now how perhaps studying art or being in a fine art institution could have really provided a safe space to kind of really explore and unpack your kind of potential and what you would like to do. And I've kind of done that in a public sphere, which has been a very different sort of story. So I decided to go off and study design specifically because I did both art and design in high school. I really loved both, and at the time I had this sort of Vega was relatively new in CapeTown, and I went to an open day and they had this whole they totally sold it. I mean, their thing is fucking branding. It's like totally reeled us in, and there's this amazing linen bound book with high varnish gloss pages, and it was all about being a maverick and changing the world and all of this, and I really completely resonated with me at the time, and I was like, fuck, that's what I want to do, you know, that's the kind of work I want to make. And so one or two, not close friends, but one or two other people from my high school kind of enrolled there as well, and I knew a lot of the top creators from my high school and in that school were also kind of enrolled there, and I wanted to align myself in that regard. So I thought, worst case scenario, like, at least I've got a degree. If everything goes to shit, I can turn left and maybe get a design job or work in an agency or whatever, you know. And so I started, but I think very quickly, you know, within a year probably of the course, I realized this is not where I wanted to be at. I didn't quite resonate with the idea of advertising, and quite cliched wise, I suppose, like convincing people to buy things they don't need, you know. I was like, I don't know if this sits well with me on a moral kind of level. And so, yeah, I guess I spoke to my folks. I was like, look, I kind of want to drop out, and I just want to do my own thing. You know, I've got my own ideas. I want to pursue this. And they were like, cool, you can do that, but you're gonna be on your own, you know. And anything after that you choose to do, like if you want to study further, that's on you, you know. Or you can finish this degree, get the degree, and then take your own route from there. So I was like, well, finished the degree, finished it. It was a pretty challenging time, but I think through that process, I tried to make a bit of work, but that wasn't too successful. And then as soon as I came out, I was a little bit at an end. I had a couple of ideas, and I actually, I had some like crazy 5-year plan of wanting to like study design, then I was going to work in an agency as a retoucher because I was super passionate about photographs and Photoshop, and I really liked kind of compositing and building things digitally. This was something that just really fascinated me, and then I think after that I was like, no, I'm not gonna. So I kind of navigated around. I took some photographs, and I wanted to kind of pursue this idea of being a photographer, and I approached actually the Cork Bay Modern with a bunch of photographs, and I was like, hey, I would like to exhibit these, and they were like, no, and I was like, sure. And I was like, shit, okay, so I'm gonna have to take another route. And then I kind of I don't know, I mean, the story can draw out both ways, but I ended up getting involved. I was working with Andrew Pato, who was my old design teacher at the time. He had started this project called the Sketch Assembly. So during that time, we worked together as a collective, and I was retouching photos, and I was working with a friend of mine, Paul Ward, and he was shooting the images. And kind of during that time, I discovered this book on color, and I started exploring color in paint. And the kind of combination of that sort of little discovery and the rejection of those photos, but wanting to make these kind of massive sort of prints of these seascapes at the time, but not having the means or the tools to kind of create that digitally, I was like, well, I've got a paintbrush, I know how to paint, and I'm gonna literally enlarge these photographs in paint.
That's quite a leap, just from not painting, working digitally, working with photography, and then just saying, oh, I'll just paint it then.
Yeah. Well, I'd painted in high school. My first oil painting I made was, I think I was 16. And I think the project, we had to pick some painting that we loved. I picked some highly complex Salvador Dali painting that I was like, this is gonna fuck me up.
Sure.
And I was like, cool, I'm gonna paint it. And I got a lot of criticism, like all the students were like, you're never gonna do that. And I did it, and I felt like I nailed it. And after that sort of sparked an interest in, then in grade 11 we had the opportunity to pursue it from our own point of view. And I was, I think at the time you start with these photographic references, and you think that painting is about copying photographs. Quite literally, it's about achieving a sense of realism with a kind of material that doesn't want to be made into something realistic, and you're like, that at the time is the challenge. How do you contain this? And while I was making my first kind of copy, it was like a kind of coastal town like photograph of Hermanus, and I was copying very intensely because I was also drawing. We had been taught like how to paint in acrylics, and when we were in like grade 8, and the idea of acrylic painting was that you build up the same color in layers and washes until it eventually becomes solid or whatever. So I sort of just employed that technique into oils, and I was being like super pedantic copying, and all of a sudden I put the wrong color on the canvas, and I was like, fuck. And I was like, I trickily try to like wipe it off and correct, and this beautiful, I was painting sand. It was just supposed to be white, and I put like a gray purple down my cover, and I was like, wow, this is something amazing is happening here in terms of that you can't achieve, or I hadn't really stumbled upon when I was painting in acrylics. And that was a turning point. It was like, wow, there's there's a lot more to this than sort of just copying.
Sure.
And I think that started a process. The next painting I made, I sort of inverted all the colors underneath and then painted them in local color, the same as the photo on top of that. And that was the technique I sort of started to employ. And so I started to teach myself painting just from that point of view, using this photograph, I guess, as a reference. And,
Sure.
and I suppose coming to now current day, that has always been a little kind of, it's changed now, but that was a kind of foundational building block starting point for me to understand painting.
No, fascinating. I think, as a painter, the whole thing of the reveal or the surprise or the unconscious mark is always the most exciting. And I don't know if it's the high school zeitgeist or the kind of pressure of painting realistically. I think that's the standard set. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a thing of, I don't know, trying to redraw your favorite Dragon Ball Z character, and that's just the pinnacle of your art career in high school level?
I think like if we look at a lot of artists' careers, especially older artists, there's this intense sense of realism. All artists start off in a realistic manner, and I think there's something especially portrait painters, this ambition to sort of achieve a kind of likeness, but by hand, and not by digital means. And that's ingrained centuries kind of old. If we have to draw on Rembrandt or Vermeer, these people have achieved this realistic style, but then we need to contextualize the fact that the camera wasn't around then, so that had to be a realism to achieve this likeness. And I don't know what it is in high school. I think realism represents a sort of sense of accomplishment, maybe.
Sure, yeah.
Because it's like, wow, you can make that look like that. That's incredible. And I think at some point I was like, I was always more intrigued by what came after, but I thought in order to get to after, you had to start at the sort of realism to understand a bit of a sort of fundamental basis, and then you could break it down.
Sure, deconstruct it.
Yeah, and that happened quite quickly.
And then what was the kind of attraction to naturalistic landscapes or the oceanscape? And
there wasn't a direct choice. I think at the time when I took those photographs, it was also just being in that space.
Were you quite a romantic at the?
Yeah, I think it was also like I remember looking at photographs by David Goldblatt, for example, and Guy Tillem, their landscapes specifically, and I remember stumbling upon one in the National Gallery by Goldblatt. I think it was of an asbestos mine. And I remember how this photograph really, in the way that it was shot, really drew you into this landscape. And I've always wanted to I've been drawn to that and wanted to create a space that when someone encounters the work, they can fall into it, they can experience it. And in the case of the seascape, or initially when it started, it was like, I just want to make that space big.
Okay.
I want to make it something that envelops you, and how do I share my experience or my feeling of being in that space at the time with you, because I think it's beautiful,
And besides your, I guess, rejection Walker Bay gallery experience, during Vega, what was your connection with the fine art community? Were you going to a lot of gallery openings? Was it this very foreign thing? How did you kind of start immersing yourself in that culture?
No, I had no connection when I started. I literally started at home in my parents' garage. I was living in the garage, painting in the garage, and then I'd made 3 paintings, and I realized, maybe I need to find a space, because it's not conducive to living and working in this tiny space. And I'd been doing some art drawing classes with another artist, Julia Thiel, in Salt River at the time.
Yes.
And I don't know if I mentioned to her, but I said I wanted to try and find a studio, and I was looking around at different spaces, and people kept saying, well, I think Julia kept saying, like, go to the Bijou. And I was like, I don't want to go to the Bijou. And like all these roads sort of started pointing at the Bijou. And then the one day I went to the Bijou, and that's where I started. There happened to be an available small studio space, quite literally under the stairs. And it's like a little Harry Potter situation. And that was my in. That was there were a group of artists who I'm still friends with today, and they've literally became my mentors and assisted me in sort of, they introduced me to the art world in Cape Town. They introduced me to different programs, specifically like the Yellowwoods, which is a conglomerate of Spear and Nando's, and this initiative at the time that they called the Creative Block, where young artists, they support local artists to make small works of art, and they buy them back, and you can start to sustain yourself. And I was introduced to that program then, I think in 2011.
So this is post Vega now.
Yes,
you finished studying, and now you...
And
okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I finished Vega, I explored a couple avenues, then I was waitering, and I worked in a pizza restaurant, then I worked in a fine dining restaurant, and eventually I was like, fuck, this is not what I want to do with my life. And so I spent about 4 months working my ass off as a waiter, try to save as much money as I could, and then in the March of, I think it was 2011, I decided to try and just go at it completely. Yeah.
And joining the studio space, that type of environment, was it quite nerve-wracking? Did you feel not exposed, but there was you wanted a certain privacy, or you weren't up to par with your peers within the space? How did you interact with that community or that creative space?
I was maybe a bit nervous, but I think I was more excited. When I painted, I didn't really want anybody to see what I was making, so I'd often the entrance was kind of like in a corner, so I would always put the easel like that. It would block the space, and then I'd work quite privately. I also, it was the first time seeing other artists in a studio space, and everybody made very different work, and I didn't know what was going on. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do my work here and paint. But I think there was also this innate, one of my friends from that time, he reminded me recently, he was like, you had this innate confidence when you came into the space. Like, you didn't care, you were just like, you were on your mission. And I think it was just like, this is what I need to do, and I didn't kind of worry too much about everybody else. I didn't feel too intimidated. I think it was more a space of like, flip, I can really learn here. And who are these people and what are they doing? And I think there was just without being egotistical, just this kind of inner confidence of like, I can do this, I'm good enough. Yeah.
Well, I think you kind of feed off the energy of the people around you, and I guess most of the time artists or creatives in a creative collective are either professional or semi-professional. Were there a number of artists in the same boat as you that were kind of starting out?
I must be honest, I was like very naive, obviously. I didn't know what was going on, but I was just like, I'm gonna do this. And the artists who were in my studio were quite a few years older than me. They were already, some of them were in galleries, they were already having quite like, kind of, some of their major shows. And so I was just like, wow, I can just learn from this, It wasn't like an overwhelming thing, it was more just exciting. Sorry, what was the...
Well, that's fine. No, that's it's just about I think the studio environment for me was a new introduction moving to Cape Town. Durban, it wasn't really a thing. Now there's a bit of it.
Because you're initially from Durban.
Yes.
Okay.
And then my first introduction to a creative collective or artist studio was just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And just having this community of people with similar goals, really pushing the limits.
Yeah.
And I guess what you'd call a safe space for creativity, where you can just go about doing it. And then there's also a sense of professionalism to it, a bit of a 9 to 5, which just kind of gives value or weight to what you're doing instead of just painting, in your basement or whatnot. And yeah, I definitely grew and learned a lot. And I can imagine coming from, say, your background, more graphic orientated, being thrown into this group of artists. I mean, your perception of what an artist was, did it change dramatically, or was it affirmed by being in a space like that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know what, like, if that makes sense, what an artist was.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you can make paintings, but that was about it. And I was painting, and I was like, that's what you do. And now I'm dealing with one artist was kind of, Kilmany Jo Liversage. She was one of the artists. Another very close artist friend of mine, Lisa Groble, she was working with multimedia. She was working with I think she was kind of making installation by sculpture. Then another painter, Elise Voskart, she was painting, but in a completely radical different way. So everybody, it totally pushes your mind in terms of like, wow, what is going on here, and how do you validate this, and what does this mean? But it was more just kind of, from a learning. I also just was like, this is what I want to do,
And then when was your first, say, big accolade or an event that gave, or a work that gave a certain amount of affirmation saying, I'm on the right track, this is a pursuit I want to
kind of continue.
I mean, the pool series, how did that, because that's what I first associated you with, or like knew in terms of your positioning or work you did in the art community. Would you say that was like a body of work that was focused and realized a bit, or?
I think so. Obviously, having come from a non-fine art background, I felt this overwhelming sense of needing to impress and validate myself within the CapeTown art scene and prove that you don't have to, or I don't have to, study in order to be a legitimate artist or a valid artist, if you will. So the seascapes happened. That was a very naturalistic process and very much a response, an emotional response to a lot of what was happening in my life at that time. And then my studio mates were like, you need to work towards a solo. You need to make a solo. And I was like, you're absolutely out of your mind. Like, not a no. And I was terrified. And then, we had this open studio event. I met these two Dutch, I'm not sure if they were collectors, but they were people who were interested in art, and they ran this thing called, this event called Art Week in Holland, and they saw my work and they were like, we want you to come over to Holland. We'll fly you over, we'll put you up for a week, and you can come and paint, and there'll be a bunch of artists from around the world. And that was the first sort of moment in terms of going, sure, I can maybe do something with this, So, but then the irony is, as soon as I got to Holland, I didn't want to paint a seascape. I was like, totally. So I think that might have frustrated them. But it was always, I think, painting and making work has always been about investigating, exploring, and pushing my own limitations. So I had kind of reached a point where I'd got what I wanted to. I've missed it back. A very important moment. Now I realize what it was. It was I had moved through the studio up into a bigger space, and I decided I wanted to. I think actually it was Candice Jezek. She was a friend at the time who worked at Salon 91. And she said, well, we're having a group show. Would I like, somehow she managed to get me an invite or an opportunity to participate in this group show. That was the first moment. And I thought, shit, I need to do like the best painting I've ever made in my life right now. So it's a small space. And I was like, I'm gonna make the biggest painting. So I made like a 2.1 by 1.7 meter painting. And I just said to, I think it was Monique Dupree, I said to her, can I have that back wall? I'm going to make this big painting. I know you don't know who I am, but it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, that's very confident.
And I went back and I fucking just spent like 3-4 weeks just working my ass off to make this work. And that was the first moment, And then things started to flow from there, and then seascapes started to shift, because that painting was also a pinnacle point for me in the seascapes. I'd got what I wanted to from what I was trying to understand at that point with the work. And then I kind of applied to the AVA to exhibit, and I was rejected the first time. And then I reapplied a bit later with a bit more of a diverse body of work and a little bit more of like a intention kind of what I wanted to create. And then that's how the sort of swimming schools started to come about. Yeah.
And how do you think, recently, say, kind of navigating the gallery system and gallerists, what do you think their perception of you was? Like, as this kind of brash young artist who's not, with this certain type of background? Or do you think people were quite intrigued? Or did you kind of pick up on anything like that?
Are you saying post my first solo exhibition?
Well, I'd say, like, when you were first navigating, did you find there was a certain resistance towards you, or?
Not consciously that I was aware of. I was aware that I was coming from a very naive kind of...
Yeah.
Well, I didn't realize I was naive at the time. But
I knew everything.
Yeah, I was just kind of like naive, young, confident. But I think it was just a case of pushing.
All right.
And just being like, this is what I want to do. And putting that out there. And actually found the adverse. Monique was incredibly supportive. We had an amazing relationship, and she was, she pretty much flipping kickstarted my career as an artist. But and she also offered me, she really wanted to have me to exhibit a solo with them. And I didn't want to do that. I had this intentional idea of really wanting to exhibit at the AVA specifically because of its heritage and because I knew other artists and I wanted to align myself with that. So that was maybe a difficult situation, but I was quite kind of stubborn and like, that's where I want to go.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, having Monique on board, that's a huge affirmation.
Yeah.
She's not shy of being honest, and
No.
Her opinion, I think has a lot of weight to it. And for me, moving to...
And she was extremely accommodating, and I think her gallery lends itself to this space that's not, it didn't have to be strictly fine art. She was like, she appreciates great work,
Totally.
And also it was a younger kind of base, with the exception of, Paul Senior, who still is associated with them. But he's also an amazing artist in his own capacity,
For sure.
But she provides an incredible platform for younger artists, and a lot of those artists are quite unknown artists, to kind of enter this art world. So, yeah.
No, well, going back to the beginning, me thinking you did UCT and then AVA, it's almost like a rite of passage. I don't know if it still holds the same weight, the institution, the AVA, but for me, I feel for a lot of CapeTown artists, you have your AVA show as your kind of launching pad.
Yeah.
To kind of, and then work off that trajectory.
Yeah.
So I also see you were in the Absa Atelier. Was it a big thing to try and enter as many competitions, apply for as many reses? After the AVA, how did you want to kind of keep that momentum and build up on that?
If I'm honest, I think the Absa, I always had this intent, I really wanted to win it, I suppose. I was just like, I also want to go to Paris.
And the cash isn't bad either.
Yeah. But it was more just like, other artist friends who'd won it, and I was like, flip, seeking that sort of validation. But maybe I've been a bit slack now with entering it because I get irritable. But to answer your question, no, I haven't really entered many competitions. I don't enter them. I kind of avoid them, with the exception of Absa. But I haven't entered that in quite a few years. It sits in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And residencies, that was a very kind of latent thing that I was introduced to only probably in end of 2014.
Okay.
So what happened after, I mean, this I like kind of naive I was then. I was like, cool, I'm gonna have the show. I was expecting like this massive sort of, it's gonna go super well, and then this red carpet's gonna roll out for me, and I'm gonna be in the top gallery in South Africa, and boom, you know, that's me, we good. And some of those things did happen, and some of those things didn't. And you know, there was a follow-up show scheduled with Salon 91 very soon after that, which was quite a tough show to do because I think there were maybe, you know, I think there was an idea that there were going to be more swimming pools, and I wanted to kind of shift direction, and I didn't have enough time to sort of, I felt like kind of nail that direction. And I realized like, wow, I felt like quite underprepared for everything that started to come after this, because then things started, like a gallery in Sydney then called me and they wanted me to exhibit there, and they were asking for a certain type of work, and I was like, no, but that's maybe not the work that I want to make, but I am sort of making, and it became this, I was quite overwhelmed. I was like, is this what now the art world is? You know, you're starting, like I've gone from like making these things I want to make to like now I need to sort of maybe fit them in or whatever, and I don't know, and I actually withdrew. I was just like, boom. And I don't know if that was a smart move.
Well, I think it shows a certain amount of integrity. Like for me, I find myself being quite the yes man.
Yeah.
You know, if certain opportunities get thrown, or you know, if this wave is good, I'm gonna ride it until it eventually takes me out.
Yeah.
But
which I think is also a super good approach.
It's an approach for sure. But I do think maybe, you know, being slightly more honest with the work you want to make, maybe that, you know, gives it its value, and maybe that's how you've kind of kept up your career. I know a lot of fine artists that, you know, really struggle to do it full time, and they have to subsidize it with other things.
Yeah.
And maybe it's that kind of being true to one's creative process, you know, is where I guess respect from institution or galleries or patrons like really absorb.
Yeah. I mean, I've realized, you know, like that how important now, looking back, how important that momentum is to capitalize on, and how hard it can be to recreate that momentum. And yeah, I think it was just kind of feeling quite overwhelmed of like, I don't know if I'm ready, or how do I, and that space has sort of been there for a while, you know. And Everard Reed then came on, I think, you know, in 2014 or 13, I shifted out of the Bijou, and we had all moved into what you're referring to as Eastside Studios. And while we were in that space, that's when I met Emma van der Merwe, because she was doing a studio visit with Lisa Legrobler, who's also represented by Everard Reed. And Lisa very kindly was like, this is Swain. We got introduced, and then Emma was like, okay, we're doing, I think, a group show in, I think it was 2015, and they introduced me kind of slowly in that way. So I've been quite focused on slowly kind of trying to foster and build that relationship with them, you know. So, and now, you know, the pace and the development has sort of shifted from that 2014 intensity to a much, maybe like a gradual pace. And this is also quite like, I guess it's unfamiliar territory in terms of it's, you know, it's a much bigger gallery.
Yeah.
You know, coming from, you know, you're dealing with a much bigger stable of artists, and you're dealing with artists who are, you know, they're big hit players within the South African art scene. And
for sure. I mean, if you think of Everard Reed, I put it as like right at the top there. I mean, when you had the in was this like payday, you know, Willy Wonka's golden ticket. Yeah. I mean, what was your perception of what was going to happen?
What, when Everard Reed approached me?
Yeah.
I mean, I thought like, I guess I'd been fortunate in the past for things to happen quite quickly, and I thought that was going to be the case, and they did happen quite quickly. But I was also have been in a space of really like unpacking like this work that I'm making and why and what and etc. etc. So I think in part there was, I had my debut solo with them in 2017.
Yes.
And yeah, it was really well received, but and then I thought from there it was just going to explode again, like I was going to go to Joburg and then this, and then because they've also got a branch in London, and I thought, I just had these expectations of like things are just going to like steamroll again, which they haven't. It's been a little bit more of a slower introductory process, and it's a much bigger system that I'm a small part of in a way,
And you think it's like there's a bit of a seniority level to it, where there's a certain amount of time or shows for you to kind of move forward, or?
I don't know about. I think my feeling is I think everybody is sort of treated with the same level of respect. Everybody is considered on the same playing field, regardless of the weight. But what it kind of comes down to, what I'm realizing, is most definitely the kind of work, and what you're putting out there and how much you want to push that.
And do they put a lot of input? Have you found that there's a certain, not pushing you in a certain way, but they celebrating certain things, discouraging other things, and just trying to help you be a better artist?
I think, no, they've been I deal very closely with Emma, and I think you'll probably hear this from a lot of artists who have worked closely with her, that, she's extremely encouraging and very supportive. And I have experienced this. There's this incredible kind of openness to saying, you need to do what is integrous to you, and like, what more could you kind of ask for? If someone's saying, make that, follow that trajectory and see what happens. So that's amazing.
And I mean, Eastside being a big part of your creative story and your journey and working in a creative space, I mean, the way you've spoken about it, when I basically took over your space and you wanted to be independent or have a independent studio.
Space, yeah.
Well, yeah, just something more private. What was the decision to do such a thing?
I felt like I was maybe losing my voice. I was starting to ask for a lot of help and rather seek opinion and validation from people around me, and I was growing quite uncertain, and I thought I need to maybe place myself in my own space where I need to force myself to trust myself again, and not ask of like, is this right or is this wrong, or can I do this or can I do that, what do you think of this, and take that kind of questioning inside myself and sit with it, that's been quite tough.
Yeah, sure.
And I still reach out, and I have studio visits and I ask for a bit of input, but in that regard, I think it's been important. I mean, pros and cons. I think it can be, working in your own studio the way I have can be quite isolating. So I've had to make much more of an effort. There's no like kind of 10-minute amazing coffee banter in between breaks. I think that's the biggest miss, because
I can just see you with this like Wilson ball with your handprint having conversation. Is it getting to that point?
Yeah, no, so I mean, then you've got to step out, you go visit other artists, and I often pop down the road to have a coffee, or like Lisa and I are still in touch, and we'll do studio visits with one another. My other friend Elise, she's now moved to Germany, and we were super close, so now it's just WhatsApp calls. All
right. Cool. But I mean, to have a critic, that's one honest and brutal critic. If she says yay, then you're on the right path. I mean, even for me, my mother's also an artist, and I back and forth a lot with her. It is nice to navigate the studio and get some opinions and feedback. But yeah, I mean, I guess you went there extreme when you were feeling encompassed by all these ideas and feedback. The biggest pro, would you say, working by yourself?
Don't have to wear headphones when you listen to music.
Well, no, totally. I mean, that was, yeah.
I was getting sore ears. I was like, I can't do this anymore.
I mean, the space I'm in now at Eastside, I have Elise's I call the penthouse studio.
Yeah. The luxury suite there.
The luxury suite.
You've got the best of both. You've got a private space in a communal space. That's what I would have loved to have.
No, totally. But yeah, and I mean, funny enough, I think a year after you left the studio space, Kilmeny was out. I took over the lease, and I mean, just coming from two dysfunctional studio spaces, knowing what's important and what's not. I mean, Eastside is still run as just like a artist run for artists, and there's no financial incentive on my side. But for me, it's such a big part of my career. If I'm able to kind of curate and make a space that's really conducive for creativity and also just professionalism, is the kind of the payback. Yeah. And it's got to a nice place where it runs really well. I think also a hard thing was, given the lease, wanting to make some adjustments, knowing it would be for the best, but then being the young one and you have all these I called the old guard. But once they left, and then I just became, I guess, the go-to. It made it a lot easier to work around. And I mean, even when Tess first offered or mentioned the space, she's like, at Eastside we have this studio opening. I'm like, the Mean Girls studio, just as a joke. But I meant it as a compliment, because I mean, there were a lot of female artists, really strong. Yeah. So I totally meant it as a compliment. But she was like, who's saying what? But happy to be in that space.
Oh, it's an amazing space.
And I mean, would you ever go back into a creative collective, or do you think the kind of independent studio is the way forward for you?
I think if I went into I think it would need to be a private space within a collective space. I don't know if I would go for the kind of semi-detached option. Just because I think there is that sort of subconscious sort of, you take on information of everybody else around you, and you're affected by that. So I don't think so. I mean, now it becomes a case of rather doing the studio visits or applying to kind of residencies to get sort of insight into those different collective minds. Yeah.
And your Everard Reed relationship, I know the amount of time and money and energy they invest into their artists. I know there's a sense of kind of loyalty or commitment to the gallery space. You navigating, say, international galleries or local galleries, is that a thing, or?
It's an option.
It is an option.
I think personally, I mean, they're open and we can chat, but I think on a personal level, my focus has been them specifically to uphold that sort of loyalty and respect in a way. If another kind of group show comes up by another gallery here or in Johannesburg, I will speak to them, we'll talk about it. Usually it's quite open and the decision is like, do you feel this benefits you? Is this an important show? And we take it from there. But it's always open to discussion. Because I think in the end, if their artists are succeeding and they're getting reach, that also benefits them positively. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if the opportunities outside, say, the Everard Reed community, lift your profile.
And I mean, no one gallery can be responsible, like...
That's a huge burden,
To say, like, we can do everything. No.
Yeah. Or we can ensure you every month that you can, afford, we can pay your rent or, whatnot.
So I think there's, you're beholden to who... I mean, no one's beholden, but I think it's more from a sort of level of just integrity and respect and mutual understanding. Sure. That's the way I see it. There's no, I can do what I want, but it's It's more like, does that benefit me or not? You know? And this is something I would like to foster because I see it as a long-term relationship. You know? Yeah.
You recently had like not a studio sale or an open studio, but you rented a space with, what are they called? Infinity Curve. It looked, I mean, unfortunately, I think I was actually recording an episode with the podcast and I missed it. I think it was on a Sunday.
Yes.
And, but I mean, seeing photos, it looked like you would like fall into these paintings.
Yeah.
Is it something you would do again just for the, I wouldn't say gimmick, but...
Yeah, I think that pop-up event was inspired by a younger artist who I was introduced to 2 years ago. He actually came to do a kind of, how do you call it, like job shadow for 3 days in my studio, and this guy absolutely blew my mind. I was like, wow. And it was so nice to have somebody with this fresh, young energy that was so passionate about what he was investigating. So we connected immediately, and he then actually had this kind of pop-up show for himself in 2018. And then he'd gone off to Michaelis to sort of study, and then he kind of didn't like the system there, and then he got accepted to the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in I think Amsterdam. And so basically this came out of, we've then been in touch through that process, and we were hanging out, making some work together, and he said, no, I'm going to do this pop-up show before I leave for Holland to try and just, also raise a little bit of money and just as a one last hit before I leave the country. And I said, yes, it would be amazing if we could also just exhibit together at some point, I think it would be really cool. And I think at the time, 2 weeks later, he called me up and he was like, do you want to do it? And I was like, what, now? In 4 weeks? He's like, yeah. And I was like, cool.
Let's do it.
And that's how that came about. So that's now sparked a whole nother idea in terms of creating pop-up shows, because I realized, it reintroduces you to how you started making work, because it's all hands-on. You had to frame it, you had to consider the mounting, the titles, the organization, the logistics, and you realize there's a lot of liberty in that kind of space to do what you want, because you're not beholden to anything or anyone. So it becomes a really beautiful experimental platform. And since then, I've now noticed all these other ones going on. And
You think that type of thing's picking up steam, that type of formula for exhibiting?
But picking up steam, I think pop-up shows have always been there. Maybe I'm just now aware of it all of a sudden.
Sure.
I think,
that sense of urgency, I think that's also why art fairs do so well. And there's almost like a thing of excitement and discovery and new venues. And then also, I think giving the artists the opportunity to have the curation process is very important. I think you kind of see your work.
That's also quite challenging, because having now worked with a gallery and gallerists, and they, now the curation has kind of almost become a split thing, and you start to rely or depend on their opinion, and you're like, ooh, okay, wait, I need to make a considered opinion now. How do I think? How do I re-edit this? And that was great to do again, that happens anyway, but you take it onto your own shoulders. I still had my old design teacher, because he was working with he had also taught the student who was now, or the artist who was now in touch with me, so he was there assisting him. So I said, don't you want to just come down and give an objective eye, because you get too close to the work, and you start being too critical and you remove everything, or you include everything, and you're like, no, but that's not the one. So a little bit of objective does help.
And I think also you just can't take it for granted. It's quite a skill.
No, definitely.
Any facet, framing, stretching canvas, all those elements, you have professionals who do it.
Yeah.
And curating's the same thing. I think people have this kind of idea as you just grid it on the wall, or you just put a nail in and bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah. No, just now working with Everard Reed, I've learned so much in terms of what you can do in that regard. Like paintings don't necessarily have to sit on their own. How do they relate to one another? The context, size, formatting, all of that. So lighting even. So, yeah.
And just to kind of finish up in terms of, I'd say Everard Reed being such a high institution within the art community, what are you feeling with Science-Mocker and the Norval Foundation? I mean,
what am I feeling?
Well, not feeling like, yeah. I mean, feeling's a very cuck word to use. Do you feel...
What are my views on them as
views,
institutions?
or do you see like maybe one day that's something waiting for you, or do you think...
That would be presumptuous. But...
Well, it seems to be working for you. Like really very well.
I mean, yeah, I would, flip if that opportunity came up. Of course, I'd love to, except because I think they're, have now become these, these very weighted institutions within our country, but also on the African continent, and I think within the world. So of course, I think, and it doesn't kind of stop there. I think, of course, as an artist, you wanna put your work into the best possible spaces where you can get the best possible reach and sort of clout behind the work, because it really, I guess it also validates it,
Yeah, definitely. I think,
but it's a two-way street.
Yeah, I think validation's the best word. I mean, even what those institutions do to our kind of global presence or the audience, it just creates that elevation.
And I think on a you start to, it's like an affirmation of your own visual pictorial language. You're now saying, okay, somebody wants to listen, or they're getting it, and you can put this out there and hopefully affect other people with it.
And cool, I think our time's pretty tight, but I want to ask like a little fun, quick question. If you could own any artwork in the world, which one would it be?
Any artwork?
Any artwork, yeah.
Panicking.
Don't worry, it won't come true, or maybe it will. But people are going to really judge you on how you answer.
Yeah, no, I'm like, now there's like things going through my head now. I'm actually going to go with, is it Robert Hodgins?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes,
right.
Local.
Well, yeah.
Our local painter, because I just went to an exhibition of his recently at the, what is it called now? Is the Valgemeent Estate, I think, just here next to Jan van Riebeck in Gardens. And they have a kind of collective show of his work with two other artists, and I saw it was the last 10 years of his paintings. I'm like, this guy is an unbelievable painter.
No, I mean, absolutely huge fan. But I mean, a Hodgins is kind of within reach, you just need to sell a couple.
Oh, at 2.1, no.
Well, I mean, you could have had a Jeff Koons or a Damien Hirst, But no, that's cool. I think it's a very strategic answer. But thank you, Swain. Is there anything you would like to punt? Any upcoming shows next year, or a website that people can follow you, or Instagram?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on Instagram at Swain Hoogervorst. I've also got a website, swainhoogervorst.com. And then I'm gradually working towards, I'll be having my third solo next year in September with Everard Reed, CapeTown. So that's what I'm now kind of in the process of gradually chipping away at.
Awesome. Thanks, Swain. I mean, hopefully, however this podcast changes and develops, it'll be great to have you back on, even if it's like a recurring thing. We'll see.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really super nice space to chat.
Cool. Yeah, and thank you, Blended Audio.
Thank you for inviting me and for having me.
Oh no, I mean, when the podcast first came up, I was like, I had this quick list of people I could interview and who I admire and respect, especially in the way they've navigated their careers or the kind of value they hold within the art community. And I think, I think we're kind of similar ages here. It's just nice to see peers just, dominating within this field.
Cool.
Yeah,
thank you.
Cool, and thank you, Blended Audio, for making this all possible. And catch me Next episode, I haven't confirmed my guest yet, so I can't punt them yet. But yeah, I'll catch you next episode. All the best. Cheers, bye. Art Pod is a South African-focused visual arts podcast hosted by Claude Chandler. Join me weekly every Saturday as I'm joined by a new guest who occupies a position within the visual arts community, ranging from fine arts, tattooing, framing, and logistics.